Sal, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Listen, LinkedIn is bringing the world to me. Like it's making such a small world after all that
I
somehow we
know.
connected all the way across the world. So you are in France, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. Paris? No.
No, I mean, I lived in Paris, which is
Okay.
fine, but I'm in Bordeaux, beautiful southwest of France, which I recommend because it's amazing.
Is it? Wow, that's amazing. Well, let us know who you are and what you do.
So my name is Salome, but you can call me Sal, as I was telling Kelly. So I'm French. I'm a communications consultant who's passionate, obsessed, all of the above with storytelling. And I've coached and guided more than 50 women, in starting and growing their freelance businesses through sort of like powerful content strategy, but very much focused on storytelling as well. Sharing the story, owning the story, how to like put this everywhere in their content. And now I do this as well, but I decided to also just expand to professional service firms in general, and teach them basically how to use storytelling in their communication strategy.
I love it. So, of course, we definitely have that in common. I could talk about
That's how
story
we.
all
That's how
day.
I found you. Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that you mentioned to me, I was so intrigued by because I feel the same, that really vulnerability is the key to a lot of times building impact in our lives and our businesses and connecting human to human. Yet, at the same time, when it comes to business, there can be a lot of reservation in terms of being vulnerable because it feels like I don't want to be vulnerable. I want to be strong. I don't want that. But just to ground us, what do you define vulnerability as?
So yeah, I feel like it's easy for us because we're like passionate about storytelling and we do this all day long. But in practice, sometimes it's very different. And I've stumbled upon, resistance, a very big resistance sometimes with my clients. And the latest is a law firm I'm working with. And as part of the content strategy, I was trying to create portraits of the lawyers, to show the human side of them, and so that people can know who exactly is defending their interests, because I feel like sometimes you spend months or years with your lawyer. So and we started doing that. So I do the interview with one of the partner, who's a brilliant woman, smart, determined. She's 33, so she's already made partner. She's balancing it all, really fun to work with. So she tells me all her story and I write it up. And and I'm like, okay, this is a great portrait. I was really happy with it because I was like, it's really her. And then I don't hear anything for 3 days. And I'm like, ooh, okay. So first thought is she doesn't like the way I wrote it, which is fine. I never take it personally because writing's so subjective. So I'm like, okay. And then I run into her 3 days later and she basically tells me, oh my God, yes, I'm so sorry. But it felt so weird. Like, it's so personal, isn't it? And I was like, literally, just for context, the only personal thing we wrote in that portrait is that when she was a kid, she's experienced injustice. And that sparked a fire inside of her and made her want to become a lawyer. And for me, that's like 1 out of 10 vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah.
But for her, it was already too much. And that really made me question. I was like, hey, so what is vulnerability? Because as you said, in our personal lives, we know that that's how we create connection. But how is it that in business, it's not that easy? And so the definition of vulnerability, I'm going to quote Brene Brown because she is the absolute queen of vulnerability. She's spent her entire life, researching the topic. And she defines it like, basically, according to her, there are three things that need to happen. You need to have risk, you need to have uncertainty, and you need to have emotional exposure for it to be actual vulnerability. And that doesn't sound good, does it?
No.
It's just like, I'm not gonna take part in that, thank you very much. So yes, indeed, it is a pretty hard thing to practice. And yet, whether it's in our personal lives or in business, people do business with people. And it's always been like that. It will always be that way. So whether it's you need to connect with your customers, or you need your team to work well, you need to connect with those people, for things to move forward. And And it's really interesting because study after study showed that basically high performing teams, it works way better than any individual on its own. Like you need teams. And for teams to work, they need a common mission, which is where storytelling happens as well. That's another topic for another day. But you need a very strong, you know, vision story and mission story. And then you need trust. That big word, you know, trust. That's what you need for people to connect and work together. And vulnerability is one of the keys, basically.
Wow. So vulnerability is risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure.
Yeah.
So for those of us that are like, look, with people that I've known and that I love, I don't want to take risks. I don't want to have uncertainty, and I don't want to be exposed. And are like, no, I'm not being vulnerable. I'm not doing that. Why should they reconsider?
So it's really interesting because unfortunately for those people, for us sometimes, there is no way around it in terms of human connection. That is basically how we are wired. That's actually why story works so well, because there is always a piece of vulnerability in there. And that's how we connect, you know, between humans. So you do need a little bit. But indeed, you know, that's a good question, is when is vulnerability too much vulnerability? You know, how do you define it? Like, where's the line between vulnerability and oversharing, where this is actually not useful at all and it doesn't work? And actually, Brene Brown, again, because she studied the topic, she's the one who stated that there's no vulnerability without boundaries. So the actual question that we need to ask ourselves is, first of all, yes, why does vulnerability work? You know, and how can it help us in our work, but also how to do it properly, because there's a way to do it properly. And the boundaries she talks about in her research is basically, to give you an example, is imagine a leader, you know, so she's, I don't know whether she's the CEO or she's just leading a team in a company, right? I say she because it's always easier for me to identify myself. And she's going through a divorce. And that specific morning before going to work, her ex-husband calls her and it gets messy, right? So she's, you know, a wreck, she's crying, she feels like crap, but she has to go to work, she has to perform. And so she gets there and her team's waiting. So that's a situation that, even if you've never been through a divorce, you know that situation where you just have to be on top of your game, but you don't feel like it because you're destroyed inside. What she can do is she can simply state, I am having a hard day. I am feeling sad or emotional today. That's it. She doesn't have to go into the nitty-gritty of all the insults she's heard over the phone. Like, that's not going to serve anyone. But she can state that to her team to let them know, this is where I'm at inside. So it's going to obviously be seen outside, right? So that they can know. And there are like some rules that you can also use, meaning, first of all, you don't have to say everything, like I just mentioned. You can just say a generic statement that allows people to know what's going on, which is still vulnerable to say, I'm having a hard day. Most business people don't do that at all. But also ask yourself if you're comfortable sharing what you're about to share, whether it's an anecdote, a story, whether you're sharing with a colleague or on stage or in a meeting or in your content. Yeah, are you comfortable sharing this? My question, I ask myself this question all the time, is if someone would come and attack me on this, how would I feel? And there are things right now that I realize completely okay with it. You know, people could come and make jokes about it or poke, or I'd be completely fine, because that's it. I own it now. The wound has healed. But there are things right now where I've wanted to share. I've even written the posts. I've prepared the content, and then I just imagined someone, you know, being mean to me about it or whatever, and I don't do it because I'm like, oh, okay, no, that would feel terrible. So So it's all, yeah. So boundaries, meaning you don't have to say everything. You can be generic about it. And then would you be comfortable with someone poking, about this topic?
Wow. Whoa, that is so good. You know what it makes me think of is giving ourselves permission to show up to work as a whole person and not, a title that has to be on all the time. Because I think part of it is we're putting pressure on ourselves to do something that we can't do and we were never designed to do. But I know I certainly feel that pressure. Like I need to show up and be on it all of the time. But like going back to the idea of story, but also giving ourselves permission to be, but I'm also the main character in my story. I'm going through a journey. There are ups, there are downs. And that is what, to your point, people relate to because they also are going through their same ups and downs. And sometimes it takes that one person to go first. And that's what leadership is a lot of the time. You're like, oh, this is a comfortable place just to be me.
Exactly. And people want to hear about you being a fool because they're fools. We're all fools. And
Yeah.
so there's something comforting in hearing a story about someone making a mistake,
Yeah.
because you're like, oh, okay, so now I'm allowed to make a mistake too. And what's interesting is that I've actually experienced this firsthand in my own business, because when I started sharing content basically on Instagram back in 2013, I think it was.
Yeah.
And I started sharing about yoga, wellness, and mental health because I'm a yoga teacher as well. And I started sharing very lots of personal stories and sometimes very vulnerable ones. And I was very inspired by someone called Rachel Brathen, who's also known as Yoga Girl. For those who do yoga, you probably know her because she has like 2 million followers now. It's insane. And she was doing just that. She was sharing, bits of her life and her heart on Instagram, and she was growing crazy, because of it. It was working so well. So I started doing that because I had nothing to lose. So I was like, I mean, that sounds awesome to build relationships with people. And it's done exactly that. I started growing, not to 2 million. I have like the tiniest community, but it was not a lot of people, but very engaged people. And me sharing those stories and those vulnerable pieces of my life, what happened is people started replying and messaging me and thanking me about, sharing all of this. And more importantly, what was fascinating to me is that they started sharing their stories with me. Like they had permission, like they felt safe to do so. And what happened is that, I mean, we were all like, basically bearing our hearts with each other. It created friendships, people that I'm actually still in contact with. I've met in real life and they've become friends, and it's created. So that was awesome, first of all. And then to go back to the more pragmatic business side of things, sorry to be so down to earth, but every single offer I put out there got sold out as a result.
There you go.
So, and it was the easiest thing to sell. It was not even selling anymore. It was this conversation of, I have a service, I have a solution to your problem, and I know you so well because we connect all the time. And it was the most human, simple, authentic experience. So it does work, people.
Absolutely. Oh, goodness gracious. This is good. So, so I wanted to highlight two things. The idea of quality over quantity, which in a way seems counterintuitive because, like you said, I want to sell up my program. I want to do all the things and I want big numbers and big, big, big. But often the key to that is focusing on the quality first and cultivating that through relationship, through story, through meaningful stuff that's real, because people can tell when it's real, like real recognizes real, and they're attracted to it, which you just illustrated. But the other thing I want to highlight that you said was, what are you comfortable sharing? And it doesn't have to be everything. I think when we think about vulnerability, we think about going deep, like sharing every possible detail you could think of. And we don't have to do that. It could be according to your level of comfort. It could just be a little detail or whatever, but that's real, that's true. And I think that's maybe even more important than the details. It's like the truth and the realness of it.
Absolutely. I think you used the word, I love this word, but real, you're real. And you don't have to share about, your ex-husband and all this like mess. It can simply be, I'm going to use a very vulnerable story and example. I'm not perfect. Like, it's happened that I forgot to feed my dog at lunchtime, and it's like, oh, like, it makes me a terrible dog owner, and I feel so guilty. But at the same time, it happens because life is crazy, and she'll be fine because she'll eat tonight and she'll be completely all right. But this is a mistake. This is not great. Just like moms, I'm not a mom, but I can so relate when moms tell their stories of how like they're completely messed up something with their kids. And I find it amazing because I'm pretty sure that's just how it goes when you have kids. It gets messy and you can't be perfect. So it can be really like tiny details like that doesn't sort of change your whole character. And if someone would come and attack me about me not feeding my dog at lunchtime, I will be okay, because I would be like, hey, just please give me a break. Like, it can be like that. But it's true that it's something to keep in mind, that it doesn't always work. So I want to talk about this because we hear about this all the time, right? Like, you need to be vulnerable, it works. And I am a big advocate for it, as you can tell. But there are some limits and there are some risks in the corporate setting, because the corporate world is a bit different than what I just told you about, with me on Instagram or Rachel Braithen on Instagram, which is content.
Right.
So with your content and marketing, of course, everyone recommends and suggests to be vulnerable in it because it works. It really does. In the corporate world, there are some risks and some things to keep in mind, because it doesn't always, just work the same way. And there's something that is really important to keep in mind, which is called so it has this like scientific name, but it's called the pratfall effect. So social psychology has studied that basically people will like you more or less, right, depending on how competent they perceive you. So let me rephrase that. For example, you have a leader, an amazing, successful leader that makes a mistake, owns it, share it, and tells the story about it. Mm-hmm. People are going to think it's amazing. They're going to be inspired by it. They're going to like this leader more for it. But if you have your average Joe that makes the same mistake, he's going to be perceived as less competent and people are going to like him less. So what does that mean? That means that, of course, vulnerability is needed in this world, but in your corporate setting, in your corporate job, it's recommended to build some credibility beforehand, before you start, adding vulnerability to your stories.
Yeah. Oh, that is a good tip. Y'all take notes. This is so good. I wanted to ask you about what we were talking about before we press record. This idea of, we do business and work in like a global marketplace now, and culturally and geographically, things land for people differently. People respond to and respect different things. So how do you think the whole cultural, where you're located, what your background is, kind of plays into how vulnerability comes off or is perceived?
That's very interesting. So my only experience is between the English speaking world and France, where I'm from, right?
Yeah.
Even though I say English speaking world, the UK and the United States are completely different as well, because I lived in the UK. It's not the same people. Yeah. It's a whole other world. But yeah, it's really struck me that I love storytelling. I've been, bathed in this, Anglo-Saxon culture, and I believe in it so much. And all my sources of inspiration are mostly American, and, the films I watch and the books I read and all of it. But then in France, the reality of it is that it's not the same culture at all, where we are very, how can I say this, way more cynical than you guys. And this is just France, right? Maybe Germany is a bit different and Spain's different. But you need to keep this in mind before using storytelling in another country, in another cultural environment, because it's like you said, it's not going to land the same way. So in France, for example, my only advice is it shouldn't be too emotional. It shouldn't be too mushy. It shouldn't be, you know, we're very pragmatic and kind of cynical. Again, you have to keep this in mind. So when you do emotions and when you use storytelling, it has to be the realist as possible and down to earth as possible, for instance. But that's just, you know, one example. I've worked and studied in Germany, and as a French person, it was also hard for me sometimes because of the cultural difference, right? In communication, I'm talking about, because other topics are different, but communication in terms of you say something and you think it's the best way to do it, but then the response is not the one you expected.
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. That's good to know. And I think it reminds us again, like the basis of a good story is tailoring it to who you're talking to. And so it's just a good reminder to make sure we consider that before we craft and launch in however we're going to communicate. Like that it's just got to be the driver. So love it. Man, this was good. Well, for those out there that want more of your genius, because you only gave us a taste, like a little drop, there's so much more. If we want to connect with you, learn more about you, how can we follow up?
The best way to do that is to contact me on LinkedIn. Let's keep it simple, just the way we connected, you know.
Right, right.
I think it works great because I'm there a lot actually because of my work. So
Yeah.
yeah, which you'll find my name, I guess, in the bio, the description of this episode.
Yep.
If I have to say it right now, you're not gonna remember it.
Fair enough. Well, this has been awesome. And this cannot just be our first and last conversation. This has to be the beginning of a thing because I want to talk to you more, period.
I would love, I mean, just right now, we've mentioned a few other topics that could be so interesting, I think, for, yeah, you listeners. So absolutely, I'd be happy to come back.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.